Good morning. I'm Alexandra Budabin. I am the chair of this first panel, which is going to look at international women's gender and queer history, meaning, similarities, and differences. I've been told to remind you that there will be a coffee break following this panel. And I think we're ready to begin. If I could invite up Professor Lindsey Earner-Byrne, please.
Super, thank you very much for the introduction, and also to Josef and Katharina for organizing what is really a special occasion, particularly for someone who's used to being in monoglot English environment, sometimes with Irish, but never with all of these languages and all of these cultures to consider. I'm going to talk today in a more general sense about doing this kind of history now. I changed my idea for the paper because of certain things that are happening in the world at the moment, and I thought maybe it might be nice to start this morning by reflecting on those. But just to explain the image there, I don't know if you can see it, it's black and white, so it's not that great up against that, but the gentleman there in the religious outfit, it was the Archbishop of Dublin between 1940 and 1972, so powerful that people referred to him as the clerical Prime Minister. And you can see predominantly young girls kneeling down in front of him there. This picture was taken in the 1950s, and in some senses it's a performance, I think, of some of the things I want to talk about today. We are, as I think everybody knows, gathering at a particular moment when a redrawing of our political landscape and public discourse has gender at its centre in visceral ways. The multiple far-right parties and groups on the rise in the US and throughout Europe all apparently share a love of so-called family values. Code, of course, for heteronormative patriarchal units, exactly what was referred to, which they express by, among other things, a hatred of feminism, LGBTQI groups, gender studies, and identity politics. A key aim of many of these groups is to see a tightening or reversal of things like abortion access, women's bodies still providing a battleground for what I would call muscular nationalisms. However, this morning I want to think historically about something which unites all these groups, and that is their denial of any systemic basis for discrimination, not just in relation to gender and sex, but racism too. That's something that they all propagate. Why do they do that? What is at stake? Well, in short, everything. A world view and therefore a world reimagined. They fear a remapping of the world in which their systems of order lose its violent mandate, where the centre is not maintained by clear binaries of gender, sex, or race, indeed where these categories lose their foundational power. For some, this reorientation represents a disorientation. And this explains, I think, the tenacity of the desire to root the world in fixed gender paradigms, and in particular to make women's and trans bodies the battleground of civilizations and cultures. I should have just gone back and said, here's sort of a classic denial of the gender component of something like violence, which I think is really, really sinister, as what we're seeing is a very remarkable increase of gender-based violence. And here too are responses to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which was a really important precursor for many other countries who in turn legalized abortion from the 1970s onwards in different trends. So these things are sort of markers along a road in which gender is being, in a sense, placed back in the center of this battle. How can thinking historically about gender contribute to a contemporary seeing of the systemic nature of this discrimination? It has to be seen. How does, for example, the historian Mo Moulton's call for, and I quote her, a non-binary historical methodology, one which centres the contingency of the categorical divisions of sex, gender, and sexuality, and allows us to see, explore, and accommodate, rather than fix, frame, and limit, the complexities of people's lived realities in the way in which we write our history. So to free up the past, we've got to, in a sense, question the very categories that we take as foundational and normal. And finally, of particular relevance, I think, to this gathering, what can we learn from provincializing gender, both historically and culturally? How is it different in different places? And paying attention to those nuanced details, I think, are a really important job for this gathering over the next day. In order to avoid what Indrani Chachere refers to as discursive colonialization, when scholars effectively reimpose the flattening weight of categories rather than questioning those very categories. It's the hint in my title, this idea of a minority to minority is a British framing of gender appropriate, for example, in the west of Ireland? Are there ways in which you should be asking different questions about those normative values which we sort of impose as taken and a given? Now, the Republic of Ireland has been transformed by its reckoning with legacy issues, or historical issues, if you like. In particular, the horrendous treatment of women and children in institutions such as Magdalen laundries, as they were referred to, our mother and baby homes, and industrial schools, which has resulted in multiple public inquiries, millions of euros, and several state apologies and redress schemes. This is a picture, not a great one, because guess what? They didn't want us to see it, so there are very few pictures of these asylums actually in operation and working. Very few people were allowed inside them, except those who were held there for their childhoods and often well into their adulthood. Thousands of women were committed to these institutions throughout the 19th century, but it accelerated after the foundation of the Republic of Ireland, far anything from being too pretty to having too many brothers and only a father in the house, to having a baby outside marriage, to having talked to a British soldier. So a whole wide range of reasons, or no reasons at all, might mean that you end up in one of these institutions for your life. This institutionalization of hundreds and thousands of women and children had its roots in the gendered schemata of the nation state. While we like to say this was a colonial import, it was adopted with gusto by Irish authorities after independence. The most recent government commissioned report provoked considerable controversy in Ireland in 2021 by declaring, and I have a quote of it here, you can see highlighted, this was a commission that sat for 5 years to figure out the relationship between these homes and the Irish state. And it found in 2021, these are the findings. I've highlighted the aspects that were most controversial. They declared the abuse of these women was first and foremost the fault of their families, their immediate families, and the men who impregnated them, rather than the state or religious bodies involved in organizing and running these institutions. For profit, by the way, these women, the laundries were sold, the work that they did was sold to hotels and various other institutions. Now, this finding was really shocking for reasons I want to consider for the rest of this paper. Historians, I believe, have a duty not to reinscribe the harm of the past in the narrative of our history. And you can only do that if you're willing to deconstruct the ecosystems of power that shaped these experiences, which why it made no sense to blame immediate families and even the men who impregnated these women. It is to not see the system at all by doing that. A history that seeks to do this, as I say, must conscientiously walk into what that power system is and ask questions about to what degree the present owes its debt to that systemic power system. I think in rooting our study in the everyday life of the past, we can render visible the ties that bind, the toxic inheritance of framing love and family in particular ways that play out to this day in violence against women, trans people, and children. We need to interrogate that very notion of family that we argue has not changed, and actually, for very many people, was a site of abuse, precisely because of the systemic framework that shapes families. Natalie Zemon-Davies noted that, and I quote her, "In the historical narrative, rigid notions of central power structures are undermined further by the study of households, families, and sexuality. All arenas," and this is the bit of her quote that I find most powerful, "all arenas where the relation between intimacy and domination is particularly unsettling." There is so much in these words, but what I want to explore today is her emphasis on what unsettles us, on being unsettled. It's our job as historians to unsettle. And when we feel unsettled in an archive, ask ourselves why, and spend longer in that archival space than you might otherwise do. But also, I think, this essential connection between intimacy and domination. These are not binaries in her understanding. These are relational. These are where the complexity of the structures of our society lie. It's why it's so hard to undo the ecosystem of discrimination, because it is based on this intimate connection between intimacy and domination. I'm reminded of an Irish Times article by the literary scholar Emer O'Toole in November 2017 in response to the Me Too movement and the Irish theatre world, in which she referred to the power of the emotional architecture of patriarchy and what is required, as she put it, to tear through layers of love and loyalty, through palimpsests of doubt and shame, to reveal the poison at the heart of the thing. So what she's saying is dismantling the power structure is so much harder because kindness, affection, and loyalty are stronger than glue and fear. We go back to the immediate family and the men who impregnated these women. The romance of patriarchy, in her reading, is as important to the grip of power as the fist. And if we want to understand the prevalence of intimate violence, we need to understand the relationship between the hug and the fist. Joan Scott's seminal article of 1986 outlined gender as a category of analysis, which had the capacity to cut to the source of power, exposing its dependency on the binaries that ordered many lives. This idea of order, I think, is really important when the world feels extremely chaotic. And that's why I think gender is being placed in this prism of it's got to do the work of ordering this chaos. An obvious example is the public and private binary, used to order gender into domains of performance that in many senses frame the heteronormative doctrine of gender itself for much of the past century. That's your father that goes out to work, your mother that stays at home. The idea that your gender has a public and private dimension and orders you, fixes you physically in the world in which you live. Of course, when historians used gender to interrogate this foundational binary, the public and private binary, they found that it crumbled under the slightest pressure, the body providing the most compelling evidence of its fallacy. Think about all those mothers and women and children incarcerated in the asylums by the Irish state. So a very private act, getting pregnant outside marriage, is one that mandates the state to invade your privacy and put you in a public institution. So it's a complete fallacy. In order to organize, if you like, along these gender lines, the very binary that bases it in foundation is violated repeatedly. We only have to think of the language of political philosophy, framed as it is by core binaries. So think about the way so many nation states organize themselves: state and civil society, freedom and constraint, sovereignty and democracy, public and private, always placed to us as either ours when we absolutely know that's not at all what they are. Indeed, in his 2013 study of British state formation, Patrick Joyce brings this back to what he calls the genderizing of power, connecting the creation between the ruling class mentality in Britain with a masculization of power and the subordination of women, something evident in the new 19th century division between domestic as feminine and public political life as masculine. All this work has reinforced how, in the axis of power, feminine and masculine ideas of gender were framed as ideologically independent. And I think that relationship between what it means to be a man and a woman is really important to why gender keeps finding itself in the eye of the political storm. This wasn't a subtle exercise, certainly not in Ireland. In fact, the explicit nature of the project was by necessity overt and performative. How you supported the nation was based on appropriate gender behavior. You had to look like and behave like a proper Irish woman. You had to look like and behave like a proper Irish man. And that took work. We only have to think of the debates in Ireland and elsewhere in which the female body was so explicitly linked to the process of state formation. In tandem, and in the Irish case in particular, it was a crucial corollary, was this muscular Christianity, was the work that the churches did also to reinforce this idea of gender as absolutely central to state and family. Recent scholarship on the formation of femininities and masculinities in Ireland point to this process as being well underway by the mid-19th century. And I think Ireland is in step with many other European countries there, which makes sense in the Irish case in both the colonial frame and the religious Catholic context, also presented as binaries, and they weren't. The colonial and the Catholic were very closely related. These are relational forces, I would argue, that enable a new modern consensus of governance in Ireland, rooted in, and this is crucial, and you see it in all the nationalist writings leading up to the end of the 19th century, preparing for Irish independence. It's rooted in a way of seeing order, best captured in the idea of respectability. I don't know how that word translates, and actually it's really difficult to explain it because it's this intangible quality that if you don't have, you're in trouble. You could end up in an institution. It's got something to do with the way you perform your gender and your social status in society. In fact, the notion of respectability provided really fertile soil for the making of an Irish modern sexual culture, embedded as it was in middle-class values of ownership. Inheritance is always key to this. Who owns the house and who's going to get the house? Who's the legitimate heir? Progress, governance, and control. In effect, respectability became an organizing principle. It had places and spaces for people, creating a logic for governance and behavior by ordering, protecting, and confining. Think of those women in the Magdalen asylums and how you're going to justify that as a script that's really about the greater good. The greatest trick of all of this was the way it masked the violence used to hold it in place, rendering it normal for the greater good, thus converting implicit and even explicit violence into reasonable correction and action for the greater whole. And that is why so many Irish people act shocked about the institutions that were right beside them for the entire century, who they had relatives that disappeared into, but they didn't see them because they had been rendered so normal. Of course, all of this certainty about what constituted the masculine and the feminine was founded on uncertainty is not that counterintuitive. In fact, that uncertainty is what kept everyone so busy trying to second-guess how they would perform. And it was essential in compliance that everybody thought being the better man and the better woman actually took work. It didn't come naturally. That was the point. In late 19th and 20th century Ireland, the constant discussion of the threat of good men and women, the threat posed to these good men and women by either bad women or British culture, which was a big feature in the Irish rhetoric, was constantly repeated over the century and used as a way of making people feel that they could belong to a culture if they also engaged in this debate. Thinking about the category of gender as contingent and relational helps us not to lose sight of the hierarchies, implicit violence, and privileges embedded in this masculine and feminine construction. But the masculinization of power and the framing of female sexuality as a threat to order were essential in placing all male-female relationships in a sliding scale of potential or actual abuse. And I think that's really important to understanding the persistence of intimate violence. Violence belonged at the heart of these relationships. In fact, it was called forth repeatedly in terms of courts actually prescribing husbands to beat their wives when they didn't behave well into the 1940s and 1950s, and also to beat their children. He who spares the child the rod spoils the child. So the idea of violence as an intimate part of relationships was crucial. As respectability became a central benchmark for social performance in Ireland, it provided a rationalisation for who belonged and who didn't. And the rules were as opaque as they were cruel. Those deemed outside the limits of respectability were framed as deviant. They deviated from the ordained path and threatened the order. The permission this ordering gave for embedding violence at the heart of social structures is palpable and had real and physical consequences for thousands of people. It resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands of children as well. In the name of order, the space of the Irish nation was politicised, rendering institutions such as the Magdalen asylums and county homes as sites for moral correction. As Sarah Ahmed notes, we only notice categories once we come up against them. We only know what it means to be a good girl when someone tells you you've been a bad girl. And those categories are benign until you do something to make you aware of the way in which they hold you. The protective veneer becomes something else, something much less benign, something with the power of moral correction, a license to control and force compliance. A dangerous mother is removed, an immoral daughter is expelled, a neglectful parent has their children taken away. This can be done for your own good, for the greater good, for the good of the nation. In thinking about these categories, we could do well to, as Moulton argues, hold our own categories more lightly, leaving space for the fuller recognition of past and future ways of being. As historians, sit with the categories we know hold us and give us license to speak in public spaces. Much remains to be done in understanding and historicising the relationship between the body, gender, sexuality and violence. Why is the circuit so powerful? What is at stake in disrupting it? And why do women and those who identify as women still tend to be on the sharp end of its violence? In a world where gender-based prejudice continues to kill, there is a moral imperative to do the work that we do. This is a collage of the faces of some of the women killed in the last 20 years in Ireland. Thank you very much.